Germany's famous U-boats are usually associated with the Second World War. However, this class of submarine first came to prominence more than 2 decades earlier during the First World War. The word prominence is an understatement when it comes to the very first time that a U-boat successfully downed a naval vessel. Because on that day, not only was 1 British ship sunk, but a total of 3 were sunk in what was one of the worst days in British naval history. And the culprit? That would be German Imperial submarine known as SMU-9. Let us delve into that day of triumph for Imperial Germany, and a day of infamy for the British Royal Navy. The SMU-9 was a German U-boat and one of no less than 329 submarines that served in the Imperial German Navy. The primary objective of these submarines during World War I was in the raiding and destroying of merchant vessels, known as Handelskrieg in German. The Germans knew that sinking the commercial ships of its enemies would have significant economic impacts for those countries. The SMU-9 sub was launched on February 22, 1910, and came into commission on April 18, 1910. It was 57.38 meters, or 188 feet 3 inches in length. Her beam was 6 meters or 19 feet 8 inches, and her total height was 7.05 meters or 23 feet 2 inches. The U-9 was fitted with 2 Curting 8-cylinder petrol engines and a further couple of Curting 6-cylinder 2-stroke petrol engines. Together, they offered the sub 1,000 metric horsepower for use above surface. 2 Siemens-Schuckert double-acting electric motors with an additional 2 electric motors were used for underwater propulsion. The U-9 could reach a top surface speed of 14.2 knots, equating to 26.3 kilometers per hour or 16.3 miles per hour. Its top speed underwater was 8.1 knots, or 15.0 kilometers or 9.3 miles per hour. She could cruise along for 1,800 nautical miles, that's over 2,000 miles, at a respectable 14 knots above surface. The U-9 submarine could dive to a depth of 50 meters, or just over 164 feet. In terms of firepower, this U-boat was armed with 4 50-centimeter or 20-inch torpedo tubes, 2 at the bow and 2 at the stern. There were also machine guns on board. The boat could accommodate 4 officers and 31 enlisted men, for a total of 35 crew. Those were all impressive enough stats for a vessel in just the second decade of the 1900s. Worth noting is that the U-boat submarines were in fact not taken that seriously at the outbreak of World War I. They were considered unremarkable and not much of a threat by the British Navy. Even the German Admiralty didn't think much of their U-boats when the war first broke out. They hardly featured high in the naval strategies of either country. It was all about the above-water battleships. That all changed very dramatically on September 22, 1914. But first, a little something about the 3 British ships in question. HMS Aboukir, HMS Hogue, and HMS Cressy were 3 cruisers of the Bacchante or Cressy class of armored cruisers, built at the beginning of the 1900s. The squadron would patrol what are known as the Broad 14s, an area of the North Sea to the west of the Dutch coast. This was close to the eastern entrance of the English Channel that separates England from France. Unfortunately, these 3 ships were considered unreliable and obsolete. Even the men that operated them were not full-time naval professionals. They were mostly middle-aged reservists that enlisted when World War I broke out. Also on board the 3 ships were many Naval College cadets, many of whom were less than 15 years old. The squadron was considered the lame duck of the British fleet. In fact, many in the Navy believed that such a squadron would be at huge risk patrolling the North Sea. They included several Royal Navy admirals and commodores, and even the First Lord of the Admiralty, none other than Winston Churchill himself. Such was the poor abilities of the squadron that it was nicknamed the Live Bait Squadron. Commodore Roger Keyes, who commanded the Harwich class of submarines, advised the Admiralty on August 12, 1914, that the Bacchante cruisers should not be in active services as they were too vulnerable to an attack. Keyes would declare, "Why give the Germans the smallest chance of a cheap victory and an improved morale?" Keyes even put forward his views to Winston Churchill on September 17th. That was just 5 days before the very same cruisers were destroyed. Nevertheless, Vice Admiral Sir Doveton Sturdy insisted that this subpar squadron remain in service until better, more modern ships were deployed. His stubbornness would turn out to be monumentally stupid and criminally negligent given the loss of life that day. On that day, HMS Aboukir, HMS Hogue, and HMS Cressy were sailing 2 miles from each other. The 3 British armored light cruisers were heading through the North Sea, just off the coast of the Netherlands. The 3 cruisers were lying abreast from one another in an almost perfect line. No zigzagging, no precautions taken to ward off submarines. Why? Because the seas that day in the North Sea were considered so rough that the patrol had to take a different route into the English Channel. So surely such waters would be too rough for submarines as well, right? Wrong, so it turned out. It didn't help that the coal consumption of the Bacante class of cruisers was very high. That is why they were sailing at barely 10 knots on the morning of September 22nd. They were sitting ducks, so to speak. The first torpedo fired by U-9 tore into HMS Aboukir at 6:30 a.m. local time. At first it was assumed by those on board that the ship had hit a sea mine. A huge fire soon engulfed the vessel. It would go down just 25 minutes later at 6:55 a.m. In the meantime, HMS Hogue went full steam ahead to try to pick up survivors from the stricken HMS Aboukir, only to itself be hit by another torpedo. This happened just as HMS Aboukir sank beneath the waves. HMS Cressy, the third of the cruisers, also tried to pick up survivors of the other 2 ships from the waters. However, it too was torpedoed 2 times, first at 7:20 a.m. and then again at 7:30 a.m. Captain Drummond on board HMS Aboukir did quickly realize he'd been hit by a torpedo fired from a submarine, and he ordered that the other 2 cruisers stay away. However, Captain Nicholson on board HMS Hogue thought his ship would be safe if he positioned his ship on the side of HMS Aboukir that had not been hit. Unfortunately for HMS Hogue, Weddigen had already repositioned the U-9 and had a direct line straight at the second cruiser. By 7:55 a.m., all 3 of the cruisers had sunk beneath the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. All it took was 1 hour and 25 minutes from first hit to final sinking. Squadron Livebait had indeed lived up to its name. The Dutch steamer Flora was the first rescue ship to arrive, and picked up 286 men, transporting them to the Dutch port of IJmuiden. The Titan, another Dutch vessel, rescued 147 men, joined by 2 British trawlers, the Coriander and JGC. The light cruiser, HMS Lowestoft, and 8 accompanying destroyers would arrive on the scene between 10:30 and 10:45 a.m. These Dutch and English vessels did all they could to rescue those still in the freezing waters. There were 777 sailors and 60 officers that survived from the 3 sunken ships. One of the most incredible stories of survival that day involved Kit Wycombe Musgrave, who was just 15 at the time. He was stationed on HMS Aboukir when it got hit. He managed to not be sucked down with the ship as it sank and swam over to HMS Hogue. Musgrave was dragged on board just before it too was struck by a torpedo. Musgrave was once again able to swim away, and this time board the 3rd ship, HMS Cressy, before it too got hit. Although now unconscious, Musgrave was able to cling to life on a piece of driftwood until finally rescued by a Dutch trawler. Unfortunately, 1,459 other sailors would not be as blessed as Musgrave and would lose their lives on that awful September morning in 1914. There is no denying that the carnage wrought that September day by SMU-9 was a huge wake-up call for both Britain and Germany. It was clear that modern naval warfare would never be the same again, and submarines would never be underestimated again. The German Kaiser would go on to award Weddigen the Iron Cross First Class, while his entire crew received the Iron Cross Second Class. Weddigen had become a national hero in Germany. From the point of the view of the U-9 submarine and its captain, Captain Lieutenant Otto Weddigen, hitting the 3 British cruisers was like shooting fish in a barrel. He would later recount how he could not believe his luck with 3 cruisers in such close proximity. In fact, Weddigen would later recount how his submarine had first spotted the cruisers when it surfaced after avoiding the very storms mentioned earlier, and what he saw stunned him and his crew of submariners. 3 large British cruisers trundling along without any patrols to protect them. The submarine was literally in striking distance. The first torpedo had to cover just 500 meters, or 1,640 feet, before hitting HMS Aboukir. The distance between the German sub and the second ship hit, HMS Hogue, was even less, at just 270 meters or 886 feet. Stunningly, it was later revealed that none of the ships even had their watertight doors sealed at the time of the attacks. Why ever not, many have since wondered. Losing 3 cruisers in less than an hour could hardly be called a stellar day out at sea for the British Navy. Not only was there a monumental waste of life, but the event showed up the hubris and downright arrogance of British ministers and the country's intelligence apparatus. There was outright horror and outrage in Britain at the loss of nearly 1,500 sailors. It became a national scandal and rocked the British House of Commons for days. A British court of inquiry would find that Captain Drummond of HMS Aboukir should have zigzagged his ship as much as possible to confuse the submarine. Captain Nicholson of HMS Hogue and Captain Johnson of HMS Cressy were also found to have been guilty of what the inquiry called an error of judgment by stopping their ships dead in the water. However, what were they supposed to do when surrounded by legions of drowning men in the waters around them? Interestingly, when Weddigen wrote at length in his memoir of the event, he noted how British news reports had declared that the 3 British cruisers had been attacked by a flotilla of 6 German U-boats, all of which were flying the colors of Netherlands. Those British reports were all nationalistic nonsense, of course. The 3 British cruisers had been sunk by just one U-boat, the SMU-9. The U-9, the submarine that caused it all, had a formidable strike rate. In under 14 months between September 1914 and November 1915, the U-boat successfully sank 4 British naval vessels, 13 British merchant steamers and trawlers, and 1 auxiliary minesweeper belonging to the Russian Imperial Navy. A total of 18 ships. The horrors of that September morning still resonate in Britain. The 22nd of September 2014 was its centenary anniversary. The day was commemorated with a military service at the historic dockyard in Chatham, Kent. 1,459 poppy petals were released, one for each life lost on the 3 cruisers.